Well, hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to this town hall session on the recommendations and the conversation has been happening for a number of months now on reimagining public safety. I'm sure you'll hear more about how that came about, so I don't want to go there. What I will say is that throughout this process, actually, bear with me for a moment. I'm going to ask everybody who's tuned in, everybody who's on this panel, to take a moment of silent reflection or prayer, a moment in recognition of the senseless, racialized oppression, murder that happened in Atlanta, where 6 Asian American women and 2 others were gunned down in cold blood. I also want you to take a moment to reflect on the response of law enforcement. Please indulge me in a moment of silence and prayer. Thank you. It is moments like this and incidents like that one that make us or made us get to the point where we're doing this work. I know it's easy for people to say this is not happened in Ithaca, New York, but we are not immune. We have had our share. Let's just be honest and let's just be real. We know it happens and it happens everywhere. Somebody, as it has been described and stated by the police chief, somebody's bad day should not cause death and destruction to others. This is not a bad day. To watch the portrayal of this gentleman in the media and what came of, and not just him, but I think back on Dylan Roof and the shooting in the church that happened when people were in prayer and welcomed him. And often what we hear is that it gets pinned on somebody's mental health or, as in this case, their bad day, except when it comes to Black and brown folks. And then it is the demonizing and the criminalizing of those individuals who often are the victims, shot down, unarmed, unjustly by those sworn to protect and serve, or by others. So yes, this is hard work. This is real work. We have to be deliberate and purposeful in doing this work. Otherwise, what we're saying to the community, what we're saying to the people who mourn and grieve every day, who cannot sleep, whose mental health is affected, what we're saying to them is that we really don't mean it. Your life really doesn't matter. The conversations that have ensued since we started this and the recommendations came out has spiraled down into us versus them. And this is not what it's about. It is not an us versus them. This is about systemic change. This is about addressing digging up the root of a problem, getting rid of that rotten root, and figuring out how we grow a brand new system that treats everybody equitably, that keeps everyone safe, and that makes sure that the age-old, systemically racist, oppressive, bigoted systems that we've been operating in and under, that we finally really and truly begin to do the work to dismantle those systems. When we begin to compare equivalencies about whose pain is worse than whose, and whether the police go home at night and whether Black folks go home at night, we've all lost when we start comparing those. So we start from a place of loss, and that's not where we need to be. We need to start from the place of sweeping and, in some respects, radical systemic change. So I'm glad that you all are joining us. I'm glad you're joining for this conversation. As a mother of Black young men, as a Black woman, I have the lived experience. And I shouldn't have to stand on the corner and cry about my experience for someone to see it as real. We can work through this. So I thank you all for joining. I thank you for being here. And I hope that we can engage in a very good conversation that helps us to look at this change through critical race lens, not just about, whose union is being busted or not. But we look at it through those lenses and we figure out how we can change what has been endemic in the American society. We built it. Race and racism are constructs that were built and they can be dismantled. We just have to be ready to give up our place of privilege, those of us who have it, and see things a little differently. Thank you again, and let the conversation continue. I don't know who's next on the agenda. I might be Jason and the mayor. I can't remember who's next to do some presentation, but I'll leave it to whoever's moderating.
I believe I'm next. So thank you, Leslyn. Thank you for the great introduction. And just for folks that don't know me, my name is Jason Milano. I'm the county administrator here in Tompkins County, joined with Mayor Merrick from the city of Ithaca to talk a little bit about the Reimagining Public Safety initiative, and then engage and have some questions and hopefully have some dialogue about that. We have some good folks with us that have also worked on the program, Dr. Sean Eversley Bradwell, Dr. Bradley Gonzalez, Shelley Michelle Nunn, Deanna Carithers, Dominic Racchio, all folks that participated in putting the plan together and are available also to talk a little bit more. So I appreciate joining this group with Reverend Clark, Reverend Benson, Reverend Wright, Mr. Nelson. Thank you for joining, as well as, and J.R. Claiborne, who's already hit me up for an hour and a half of questions today, and he's gonna hit me up for some more. So it's good to see everybody. Thank you. I guess if that's all right, I'll jump right in, Mayor. But before we start, do you want to pass it over to you real quick? If there's any remarks you'd like to make, and then we'll get into.
Well, I want to give my appreciation to Leslyn for that moving and really centering introduction, and good reminder of why we're in this work. This has been the most complicated and trying work of my professional life, and as Leslyn said, there's a reason for that. These problems are deep, they are wide, and there is so much fear involved. And I think the more we can have forums like this, and that's why I want to thank Pastor Benson and Reverend Clark and Reverend Wright for hosting, JR for hosting, and allowing us to all talk as a community about what's in this plan, what's not, and what could it could mean for our communities is really, really important. And if I could just use this opportunity to say to any of our AAPI brothers and sisters who are viewing that it is reasonable and understandable to be afraid. I mean, the uptick in anti-Asian violence is real and is reprehensible. And like any virus, this virus of hatred is hard to spot and hard to stop. But part of, in my experience, having been on the other end of terroristic threats myself because of my own identity, it is such a relief when people who don't share that identity speak up and say, we see this too, we see it happening, and we will do what we can to protect you. And so I just want to extend that and say that every conversation I've had with city staff in the last 24 hours has centered how we can do a better job of vocally and visibly standing up for and protecting our AAPI neighbors here in Ithaca.
Thank you, Svante. I guess at this point I'll share the screen with folks, and we'll start to talk a little bit about the Reimagining Public Safety Initiative. And I think Svante, what you ended on is an important piece of this. Let me pull this slide up for you if I can. If I can find it, I'm sorry. There we go. I think you can see that. What you ended on is the center of this process, and I think I'll skip just to a slide here to talk about how this came about and what this process is about. This process that developed this report, or that this report was developed in response to, is an Executive Order 203, which was issued by the Governor of New York back in June. And following George Floyd's murder, the governor set out to task municipalities, counties, cities, towns, villages with police departments to really focus on eliminating inequities in our policing, focusing on the fact that marginalized members in our communities, particularly communities of color, Black and brown members in our communities, have been discriminated against through the mistreatment of policing strategies. And this effort was to focus on eliminating those racial inequities in our policing. And as we went through this process, and I'll talk about the process, and we'll also hear from some other folks that was involved, it was really trying to look through that lens as we were looking at recommendations as to how we begin to break down barriers and systemic challenges in our policing system. This was a collaborative effort with the city and the county, primarily because we feel we serve similar constituencies, and the efforts that we take should be similar in nature. Approaching these barriers and approaching these systems is beyond, in our perspective, just law enforcement. And this is partly why we talked about it being the reimagining of public safety collaborative versus reimagining law enforcement. And part of those reasons is that this reaches well beyond just law enforcement services. It reaches our health and human and social services. And as we're looking through an equity lens and the way we deliver in law enforcement, we need to look through an equity lens as well with our social services, our human services, and our health and human services. And when we talk about how we're providing these functions, how are we doing it in a humane way? So the purpose of this, and I think it's important that the reason we put this slide in this is to understand the focus point and the focal point as we went through this process to ensure that this was the lens we were looking through as we put these recommendations together. A little bit about the timeline, just to give some context, and then I think we can get right into, and before maybe I do that, I would call on Dr. Bradwell and Dr. Gonzalez to maybe give a little bit of understanding of their role in this process as academic and researchers, and how it was important and who they spoke to and what their function was. But the process involved really identifying ways of getting community input, particularly from our communities of color, particularly from our marginalized members in our community, to understand their interactions with law enforcement and the public safety system, and take that engagement and really try to focus on it. Evaluate the current state of our law enforcement. What do we do now to understand some of the systems and structures in place, and then develop recommendations around how we can start to break down some of those systemic barriers. And then, as you can see, some of the recommendations themselves, while most of them are city and county recommendations, there are a few city specific and there are a few county specific, and the mayor and I will go through them kind of point by point, give a little bit of an overview of it. And then I think after we go through that, I'd be happy to open up for questions. But before we go through the recommendations, I'm wondering if I can have Dr. Bradwell and Dr. Gonzalez talk a little bit about their involvement in the community input process. I'll give a little bit of precursor, then I'll pass it over to you two, if that's all right. Part of the public engagement process involved engaging and getting citizen feedback. We did that through a series of community voice forums, most of it done on Zoom. And that's primarily because of the pandemic. A very challenging a way of approaching community engagement when there's very little opportunity to do in-person discussion. And that obviously wasn't by choice, it was just due to the pandemic and COVID-19. However, that said, there were probably opportunities where we were able to reach members of the community that otherwise may not have come to an in-person meeting. So while there were some challenges, there were also some benefits to it. As part of this process, there was a concerted and focused effort with connecting with certain subgroups in our community that perhaps maybe otherwise wouldn't normally participate in a public engagement process. And a big shout out to Shelley Michelle Nunn and some other folks on the communication team that use their personal relationships to engage with folks and say, listen, we want you to engage in these focus groups. These focus groups involve a variety of different members of the community, some houseless members of the community, different subgroups, veterans, members for communities of color, other different marginalized members in our communities, to facilitate conversations, to get that feedback. And those were facilitated by professional facilitators. And then that information was then gathered, and then Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Bradwell then took that information and started to categorize and identify themes that were then used for input and consistent input to develop these recommendations. So that's the broad perspective of community engagement. I think just for a brief overview, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Bradwell and maybe Dr. Gonzalez, summarize that a little bit, and then maybe just touch a little bit on some of those themes, if you could, that you outlined from your review of the data.
I don't have much to add because Jason did a great job of summarizing the process. But I will say two things. One, I want to thank Leslie McBean Claiborne, not only for the amazing community service that is ongoing even after deciding to leave the legislature. Your role in our community is unmeasurable, but more importantly for grounding us in the reality of where we find ourselves and reminding us that the work we do has real consequences. And so, again, appreciative of that centering and trying to do all that I can personally to make sure we build a better community here in Ithaca, New York. I'll leave some of the commentary, obviously, to my colleague, Dr. Gonzalez, who's been doing some work, but just to focus on a couple of quick items. There was a lot of information to parse through, but we tried exclusively to focus in on focus groups, where we had roughly about more than 130 participants, as Jason indicated, from various stakeholder groups, including members of our LGBTQ community, Latinx community, Asian American community, folks who are returning citizens. And you can find the full list of the focus groups in the appendix 2 of the report. But also to be very intentional that there was an intentional aspect on our side for what we call in the scientific community to oversample from particular voices. And for us, what that meant is going from zero participation to some participation. Historically speaking, a number of minoritized communities don't participate in these events. And I can tell you personally, and I know we have a couple of reverends on the line. I apologize. I heard a couple of cuss words when I asked people to participate, right? Like, no, I've been down this path before. Why would I do this now? How many more times is a plan going to sit on the shelf? And so it was an interesting moment to try to risk relationships to encourage folks to offer their insights. And Belisa and I did not write the report. All we tried to do was to do our best to uplift the voices of folks who normally would not be sought out to have their voices included in this report. Does not mean that everyone was included. Again, 130 people out of a 60,000, population community. But we were very intentional to try to make sure that we captured the voices, including focus groups with law enforcement. That should also be stated as well. So again, I'll leave it there, and I'll let Dr. Gonzalez add whatever I left out.
Thank you. And I also want to lift up Ms. Leslin for grounding us in what is truly important, and I think keeps a lot of folks going. Certainly those folks who participated, and it's to make the world a more just and equitable place, and to take the racial injustice in the world on head on. And this work is not easy. And it's also not finished, even with the passing of this proposal. I just, for me, this is going to be all about the implementation and really holding folks accountable to what we say we want, and that is a more just and equitable world. So having said that, so I'll start talking as a researcher now instead of Belisa. So I want to reiterate, because I don't think that this point has been disseminated enough, that law enforcement were a part of focus groups. Dr. Bradwell and myself and the other facilitators did not conduct those focus groups, but we did analyze that data. Dr. Bradwell and I did analyze that data. Members of CPE facilitated those groups, and so there was a considerable amount of overlap in what the targeted focus groups reported and those law enforcement groups reported. And I do see those things reflected in the recommendation, which again, Dr. Bradwell and I did not write. What we did is we identified themes. And one of the most common themes that came up was about the need for folks who are prepared to handle and trained in handling folks who are living with mental illness and other sorts of visible and invisible disabilities with the LGBTQ population. And so there was a lot about training that came up, and so just to give you an example of where we saw similarities between what the target group focus groups said and what the law enforcement group said is, the targeted focus groups, everybody talked about mental health needs, everybody. That came up in every targeted focus group, right? And so, saying that, we need people who are better prepared and equipped and trained, right? And then on the law enforcement side, they said similar things from a different sort of angle, right? That yes, we need there are particular calls that that we need assistance with, largely framed in terms of more resources, but there was an acknowledgement there on both sides that something different needs to happen, and I see that particular point reflected in a couple of points in the recommendation. And so I won't go into all of the overlaps, but I did want to point that out, because I do think that there's not complete overlap, certainly, but there are points that I do think that we could come together at. And as Ms. Leslin said, the us versus them dynamic does not help that coming together. And just very quickly, to point out a couple of other ones, one of the reasons we do qualitative data collection and focus group data is to be able to hear the experiences of folks who are most impacted and overwhelmingly negative impacted by their interactions with police. And I would ask us to believe those folks, right? And over and over again, what we heard is a feeling of disrespect and dehumanization on the everyday interactions with law enforcement, right? And so I know there's a lot of attention paid to to deaths that happen in other cities, and it's easy for folks to say, well, that's not us. Again, as Ms. Leslin pointed out, but that if we think about what kind of bar that is, that's a pretty low bar for anybody. And so, and it also was not primarily what the focus group respondents were talking about. They were talking about everyday interactions and, certainly being stereotyped, being treated because of a past interaction or a record in some cases, and really just wanted to be seen as human beings and helped. BIPOC respondents are certainly hyper aware of the racial tensions. So events that like those that happened murders that happened in like those that happened in Atlanta certainly, are on the minds and hearts of folks of color and other minoritized communities. And there's, a sort of an acknowledgement that needs to happen there, and it does raise tensions. Something else that came up a lot was that respondents in particular communities, this was not true of all the target groups, but enough to raise to the level of a theme, are expressed just not calling police and handling situations themselves for fear of things escalating once the police or law enforcement shows up. And so this has the effect of only calling law enforcement when things escalate to a pretty high tension point, which also means that it increases the likelihood that when law enforcement does get here, they're the only interaction they have with those folks or when at those points of high tension, right? So, and lots of talk, another intersection between what we heard from the target groups and what we heard from law enforcement in terms of wanting to have more time and more research to actually to interact outside of being called because of something is going wrong, but rather more community relations. And that was something that was expressed by in the focus groups, with the targeted groups and law enforcement. So that's another point of intersection. So there are other themes, but I know that we want to get to the question and answer. We can certainly talk more about them if there are other questions, but I did want to highlight those. And again, just return to where Ms. Leslin brought us at the beginning in grounding our work in believing what people's experiences are and trying to move from there.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. Thank you, Dr. Bradwell. Appreciate you elaborating a little bit more on your involvement in the process and some of the findings that you came across. I'm going to put the presentation back up, if that's all right. And the mayor and I will go through some of these recommendations briefly so that we can get to some of the Q&A and answer some of the questions that folks have. Mayor, why don't you kick us off here with the first recommendation?
Sure. So this one's specific to the city of Ithaca. The idea is to create a new department. We'll call it Department of Community Solutions and Public Safety, that would have 2 units inside of it, both units reporting to a director of the entire department that need not have a law enforcement background, could be civilian. What's the rationale behind this? The rationale is that we know that the militarization of the police and the presence of weapons can escalate certain situations and trigger adverse reactions, particularly with people who have had past traumas. And yet there is a need, particularly in a country we have more guns than people in this country, there's still a need for an armed response for certain types of calls. But could we imagine and create community solution workers, workers who respond to problems in neighborhoods, right? Walk beats, right, are available 24/7 to interface and engage with the community, to respond to calls with extremely low likelihoods of violence or needs for arrest. And could we hire for those jobs from within the community? Could we encourage young people, people of color, women who right now, all three of those populations are what we need in the public safety profession, and they're the folks who are least likely to consider careers in public safety right now. Could we find folks who want to serve, they want to help their neighbors, but they don't want to carry a weapon, effect arrests? Could we find for them gainful employment that increases the proactive and positive footprint of public safety in our community? And again, all reporting to a new director of public safety and community solutions, so that we can hire for the skills required for the job, which is excellent communication, the ability to manage budgets, the ability to manage people, the ability to understand the full range of public safety needs in a community. Those things could come from a person with a law enforcement background, but they could also come from civilians. And this would give the city more flexibility in who it hires to lead this new department.
Great, thank you, Mayor. I'll take the next two, which are county-based recommendations. I'll start the one here: evaluate existing models and implement an alternative to law enforcement response for crisis intervention and wraparound health and human service delivery. So, just to build off of, I think, what Dr. Gonzalez had mentioned with respect to a common theme that we received was an unarmed or a non-uniformed response, particularly to crisis intervention, health and human service needs, mental health needs, and how can we incorporate some alternative to a law enforcement response. And I think this concept is built a little bit off of some other concepts we saw across the country. One in particular is a CAHOOTS model, which was out of Eugene, Oregon, where you have a civilian workforce. It's actually a nonprofit agency that contracts with the city that responds to health and human service needs in the community. Sometimes it's a co-response with law enforcement, sometimes it's without law enforcement. A key component to that is how calls are received and dispatched, but it also provides the extension of those services and the connection with additional services that may be needed in the community that right now otherwise is only served by a uniformed officer. So this is, I think it's important to say also that, regardless of all of these recommendations, ensuring that we're incorporating them in a lens with equity is going to be incredibly important, and not putting them into an existing structure that doesn't address concerns and equity issues as the whole approach of this initiative is about. But this is really about trying to provide additional resources to folks based on their need, rather than having a uniformed officer respond to it. If I go down a little bit to this, better align available resources with emergency response needs by establishing a pilot program for non-emergency calls. Similar to what the mayor just called, this is a pilot program in the sheriff's office that would provide an ability to respond to calls that don't need necessarily an in-person response or a uniformed officer response. So it would be a civilian that would be able to manage calls. And this does several things. Number one, it takes a uniformed officer out of that immediate response, frees them up for other urgent needs, but also is the ability to have them have more available resources to do community engagement, to do those other responses that don't necessarily require them to respond to a non-emergent call. So it's about freeing up resources within our department. I can take this, Mayor, if you'd like. The next series of recommendations are collaborative recommendations. They're ones that we view that, as the majority of them are, that the city and the county work collaboratively on and work on and joining our resources as we kind of plan and then implement together. This first one on the upper left is identify a new curriculum, redesign and implement a cultural responsive training program that incorporates de-escalation and mental health components into comprehensive response for law enforcement. So this is really focusing and ensuring that our law enforcement officers have the adequate mental health training, the de-escalation training, cultural responsiveness training, not only periodically throughout their career, annually in their career, but also prior to them even hitting the road in terms of getting as a uniformed officer. So this is something that happens either pre or post academy. And it really sets a tone of expectation of what we think of our officers, you know, ensuring that they have the appropriate resources to deal with all of the situations that they may come encounter with in our community. If I go down to the bottom, develop a comprehensive, inclusive, and innovative recruitment strategy for law enforcement and correction officers. This is about really ensuring that we're taking an aggressive effort to reaching out to all members of our community and not only recruitment and recruiting members from a variety of subgroups in our community and encouraging people of color to apply to be correction officers, to be law enforcement officers, but also retaining and spending a lot of focus in ensuring that we're retaining our staff so that we have a diverse workforce and a workforce that's also committed to the community, which I think is incredibly important. Next, develop a comprehensive community healing plan to address trauma in the relationship between residents and law enforcement. This is addressing one of the key components I think we mentioned earlier, which is a breakdown of trust in the community. Trust with law enforcement officers, the community has in engaging in law enforcement, acknowledging generational trauma that's taken place, and how do we begin to build a foundation through community conversations of trust amongst our community members and our law enforcement community. This is about improving the soil in our community so that we can grow and succeed long term and start to break down some of these barriers that exist. I think it's an important recommendation throughout all of this. It speaks to the foundation and fundamental trust within our community, amongst our community, and with law enforcement officers. Develop a countywide program to promote and support holistic officer wellness. One thing that was identified in the focus groups was that officers have challenging work that they do. They experience trauma themselves. They also need certain support services, whether it's peer support or mental health support, to support their wellness, both mentally and physically. And we want to ensure that we provide that as employers, but also so that they can do the best at their job.
Yeah, the next bucket is around our data, with the belief that we can't improve what we don't measure, and that if we both measure how we're doing and are transparent with the results of that measurement, it will help us hold all of us accountable, not just members of law enforcement, but the elected officials and the community at large. So first, we'd like to standardize our data entry and review existing data sets for more actionable insights and allocation of public safety resources. That's between the city and the county. We would like to know, what is it that our officers are spending their time doing? What are the results of that work? And how can we make investments that will improve those results? That ties into the next one, which is the development of a real-time public safety community dashboard, making all that data accessible, readable, and updatable in a timely way so that people can log on, they can see, this is what our public safety departments are doing, this is how it's working, and there's a real-time measure of activity in our community. The next one, collecting and evaluating the results of officer-initiated traffic stop enforcement. We know this is one of the more dangerous things that our officers do. We also know it's a point at which much you can see, this is a spot where you can see if discriminatory enforcement's happening. This is where it will show up in our data. So we want to know that. We want to be able to study it and measure it so that, again, we can adjust our resources, we can adjust our training, we can adjust our procedures accordingly to eliminate bias in enforcement.
Thank you.
Next ones, also to repurpose the SWAT mobile command vehicle to the Tompkins County Department of Emergency Response, and to put around that vehicle some policies for its use. We know this came up quite a lot, along with the next one, which is conducting a review of SWAT callouts to determine the appropriate use of the service and the equipment. This is the tension between the need, as we see mass shootings and mass killing incidents nationwide. We've also had a few close calls and scares, people amassing weapons here locally or bomb making materials, knowing that we need a tactical response for those instances, but also listening very deeply and taking very seriously the communities who feel like the SWAT team is menacing and intimidating to them, particularly the vehicle. And I think people are connecting their own lived experience as well as a historical experience where SWAT teams have been used to quell civil uprisings, particularly in the 70s, and the use of some SWAT equipment for no-knock drug raids, which are, again, one of the most dangerous things our law enforcement agencies do. A reevaluation of, is that appropriate? What's needed and where is what these two recommendations are calling for.
So the next series of recommendations are what we'll call advocacy recommendations. This is, acknowledging that New York State needs to partner with our communities to really make some changes in certain systems and structures that do not promote equity in our approach to how we're hiring folks, to how we recruit folks. Civil service, if any of you is familiar, is a system we have to follow that prevents and creates challenges when we talk about diversifying our workforce. So two of these recommendations are to the state of New York to change some of those processes so we can recruit folks and we can recruit talent in our organizations. One is also requesting collaboration with New York State in terms of New York State troopers. As you probably may know, New York State troopers do patrol Tompkins County. They do respond to calls. And we want to ensure that when they respond to calls to our constituents, that they're responding in the same manner that we would, and we want to ensure that they're providing the same level of service and expectation that we would. The last is urging the governor and the state of New York to reform the disciplinary procedures for law enforcement. So right now that process is governed by Civil Service Law Section 75. Is a challenging process. It's definitely not a process that provides expediency when we talk about disciplining officers, and it's an important piece from an accountability measure when we talk about holding officers accountable for misconduct to ensure that this is reformed so we can do it in an expeditious way versus now where sometimes it takes months, if not years, to resolve disciplinary matters.
So next is a series of recommendations around increased accountability. First is to grant the City of Ithaca's Community Police Board. This is a board appointed by the mayor, confirmed by Common Council, of citizens who right now what they do is they field either complaints or compliments around our officers and their work. When there's complaints, they do investigations. When there's compliments, they issue recommendations for commendations. Right now, all of those recommendations are advisory. They're just that. They're just recommendations. The community was saying through the feedback they would like that board, a civilian board, to have more power, the power to actually issue discipline and issue commendations. So the recommendation is to give them more authority in order to increase accountability and, importantly, community transparency around that accountability.
I'll piggyback off that. Currently, Tompkins County does not have something similar to a community police board, and create a Tompkins County Public Safety Review Board is the effort to evaluate if a similar type of citizen oversight board should be created for the sheriff's office. We don't have one, and there's some thought that needs to be put into whether or not we should create one, and if so, what's the scope of that authority, and how would that work and how would it function? So that's the recommendation on the right, creating a public safety review board, or at least evaluating it. If I go down to the bottom left, require public disclosure of district attorney and assigned counsel office statistics on a quarterly annual basis. So all the recommendations so far are talking about law enforcement. Some are talking about mental health or other services. What haven't talked about so far is the prosecutorial and public defense side of this process, this public safety system. And this is about disclosing data around cases, around demographics of cases, outcomes of cases, so that there's an understanding and a public disclosure and transparency with respect to how the district attorney's office is functioning and how the assigned counsel office, which is a public defender's office, is functioning. Lastly, the recommendation to create a community justice center with staffing and resources to support these recommendations, I think, is probably a key component to being able to successfully further plan and then implement these recommendations. And the comparison that we've used in the report is during this global pandemic, the COVID-19 response, the county's ability to respond successfully to this is because we have put the human resources and the monetary resources to that response. And we feel that if we're going to make an aggressive and substantial effort to eliminating inequities in policing and the mistreatment of our community members, we need to put the human resources and monetary resources to facilitate the changes, the structural changes in the systems that we've talked about. And that's what this Community Justice Center is about. It's about hiring 2 additional staff for the sole purpose to work with those departments and agencies to be able to effectuate and implement these recommendations. This is the last. There are no. This is the recommendations put forward in the report. The next steps is really input. That's part of what we are here tonight, is to get feedback, answer questions, have more dialogue, be able to develop these recommendations further, take this input, and then forward it to our legislative bodies, the Tompkins County Legislature, the Common Council, who between now and the end of March have to adopt a plan. Either amend what's been proposed or adopt as is, and that has to be done by April 1st and submitted to the state of New York. And then following that, it's then the next steps of establishing a community justice center and then moving forward with implementing these recommendations. So that is that encompasses the presentation of the report. And I guess I'll pass it over to the moderator to take it to the next step of the program tonight. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Pastor Benson, and I'm glad to be here. Leslin said something that struck my mind, and it is made to do the work. Our environment has been so created that we're now made to do the work. And that's what I see. I remember when Sean Greenwood was killed, the community came together and they were made to do something. And that something was, especially in the religious community, we got together as a group of religious leaders and people in the community, and we began to pray at every individual church in our community to in turn bring together the people to deal with the situation that went down. And out of that group, because we're not, we've got to be pushed to do things. Out of that group came the community leaders of color to address issues that were in our society here in Ithaca. In other words, the only reason why we moved was because we were made to do it. We were forced to do it. We couldn't do no other thing but to address the issue. And I think that's the process now. We need a greater voice in the community of equity. And I think that's what I see the report, or the recommendation, the process, the need to hear more voices of equity in our society. And I think that's important. And I'm looking at the recommendations our health system is down. We're not mentally thinking right. And I think that's certainly a great issue, whether it's with the police force, whether it's with our school system, whether it's with our legislators. Our health mentality has been attacked, and we do need to, in turn, address the issues. And now we are forced to do, hey, you're too violent, policeman. And it's been an ongoing thing. And so I see us addressing it now. And that addressing has forced us to work. And that's what I love about our community, our leaders of color, community leaders of color, that we were forced to address issues that we were letting go on. And I commend you, Mayor Savante, for addressing an issue that was touchy, that you come up against, recommending that we need to look at health issues in our law enforcement issues and those who are we've hired. And I think that that's important. And I think that we've been made to look where we might have been looking off. We've been made to do it after seeing the tragedies that that are in our society. So I'm seeing the need, and we saw the need. We saw the need as preachers to pray, and we didn't see it until the tragedy occurred to Sean. And we went from church to church, from church to church. The only thing I think is we stopped, and that's the problem. Sometimes we start going and then we quit, because things are. So I'm seeing crises of human services. And we need to address our human services that we're giving to the people, and it needs an overhaul. And I think that certainly is what is being on the board today. And we need collaborative union in this. We need everybody involved in it, and that's sometimes difficult to get people involved. And when you buck in the system, naturally, Savante, the police union is going to come out in force because we don't like change. So I'm seeing the need for a change, and we saw that. And I was out jogging or walking. I'm too older to jog now, but I was out walking in the park, and I saw the girl from the Methodist Church who spearheaded our prayer vigil around the city. And what it really said to me that we should do something else again. And I think that that's important for us to realize that there is a change, and we do need to address the mental attitude of our police department, the mental attitude of our society, and to bring about what we need. And I am saying, let's go for it. And going for it means that you're going to meet opposition, but hey, let's go for it. And I think when we are together in this as a community, whether it's the religious section, whether it's the educational section, whether it's the police, we do need to work together in this issue and to deal with the tragedies that have been occurring. And we've got to look at it now. We've got to look at it. We've got to do something about it. And I think that you'll recommend also of community involvement is so important for us. And I'd like to just say, hey, Lord, give us the strength and fortitude to do it and to continue it. Because one thing I found out that we start a good thing and then we get slack, Reverend Nathaniel. I'm not throwing a bolt over there, but we do sometimes stop. And I think now's the time, Sister Gonzalez, for us to push forward and make this effort. So I'd like to have a quick word of prayer before we go on behind all of Ken's books. Heavenly Father, we thank you. We're asking for direction. We're asking for you to guide us, and we want equity in the voices that haven't been heard lately in our community about the injustices that we see in the police department, possibly at City Hall and the taxes, wherever the injustice might be. We're asking for help to address these issues and give us the intellect, give us the wisdom, give us the cooperation, the collaboration that's needed. And this we thank you for, and the continuance. In Christ's name we pray, Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, excuse me, Pastor Benson, for framing and providing perspective for us in terms of this Reimagining Public Safety initiative. And now that we've heard from County Administrator Milano, Mayor Myrick, Drs. Gonzalez and Eversley Bradwell, we wanted to hear questions, comments from several of our guests, and these include J.R. Claiborne, of Director of Veteran Services, Brad Nelson, who is with us, Reverend Nathaniel Wright, pastor of Calvary Baptist Church, and Pastor Benson as well. And just to provide you an opportunity just to respond to what you've heard and have read and over the period of time since we began at 6 tonight. So we want to open the floor up for your immediate responses and comments, questions, concerns.
If I may.
Yes, you may.
Thank you. First off, Leslin, very well said, putting us in that direction, putting us in that place where we need to be and not quickly forget. Doctors Bradwell and Eversley Bradwell and Gonzalez, thank you for your work. And thank you all, everybody else, for being here. Pastor Benson, thanks for the prayer, because I need it at this point. And you made some very good points about where the change needs to come. We have focused on the police department itself and how the police department deals with the community, right? I get all that. I understand that to the fullest. I was a police officer, but my skin is also brown, right? But there's one focus I cannot let go to the wayside, and that's how trying to listen to a proposal to change something externally when the change needs to come internally, and it needs to come from how employees are dealt with. And more specifically, I'm going to say officers of color, right? I come from an experience of officers of color, and the word reimagining. We're using this word reimagining. We're using words like protection. We're using words like all those words. But I can bring myself to 3 particular officers of color, 4 officers of color in the Ithaca City administration when it came time to reimagine putting someone of color in a position of authority. It didn't happen. 3 times, it did not happen. My concern is trying to listen to a plan to reimagine, right? If we're going to reimagine, then we have to look within ourselves. And is this real? Do I believe what I'm putting out? So on and so forth. Again, I'm pulling from a higher source that I'm trying to not to be truthful, but also to get at a point that is not just about policing itself. It's about administering as well, right? If you're not administering well in reimagining, I don't understand reimagining something when you had the chance to reimagine 3 times. 3 times. And now you put someone else on the hot seat in the wake of your reimagining. It's a little difficult for me to sit here and listen to proposals and sweet talk and Jedi mind tricks it's disturbing, to say the least. When, again, I'm going to say 4 Black officers had the chance to be put in positions of reimagining in the city of Ithaca, and it did not happen. Those of you sitting around here on this feed don't know that information, right? You didn't ask that. But if I tell you the names of the people and you start asking questions, and the questions are why? Why doesn't this happen? But we want to talk about reimagining. We may not have had to reimagine if the imagine had happened then. You put somebody into place that you have this envision for your police department to run because you have this reimagine, and it didn't happen. So yes, I'm a little jaded. I don't want to refute the efforts of what you all have done. I get it, but I have to step back, rewind, and look at the smaller picture for folks trying to tell me to reimagine something. It doesn't work for me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Brad. I'd like to hear comments from others.
So, we in Baptist church circles, once everybody's been addressed, all you have to say is order has been established, and you don't have to call everybody's name. So thank you all for your efforts and everything that you've done. I do, and forgive me if I have listened to a number of these, and so you may have said this at a previous one, but all of your voices are starting to sound the same. All right, all these are starting to run together for me. So, so I don't know, Mr. Mayor, if you talked tonight or at a previous one about this idea of demilitarization, and kind of, so what does that look like to you moving forward?
Yeah, for sure. And I think we have to understand why it's important, what people's lived experience has been with policing in the last 30 years, especially, has been one in which, I mean, what does it mean to be militarized? You start with the weapons, right? That's the most obvious one. Was the weapons and weaponry of war can send a signal when you see it on your streets. Start from the trucks to the cars. Is it intimidating big black SUVs? Is it approachable sedans? And then the firearms, of course. But it's also about an attitude of occupation or invasion, right? And that's about, are the officers, do they live and work among us, right? Do the people who make up a public safety department, do we know them by name? Do we feel connected to them? Do they know our community and our struggle? And a big part of that is about whether or not they spend time inside the city. Do they live inside the city? And if not, are they inside the city when they are off duty? Because if not, then the only experience we have of them is when they're working, but also the only experience they have of the community is when they're working. And I mean, Brad could tell you, it is a difficult job. It can be a dangerous job. And the feeling of, I take very seriously the officers' reported feelings of, when all we see of the city is when we are on duty. That is a different perspective. So demilitarizing is part of, it's reassessing the SWAT team and figuring out what equipment is appropriate, what's necessary, and what could we function without. But it's also figuring out a way to respond, to show up unarmed. And that's what the community solution workers are about. There's a whole host of, because I think it's important to be quite humble. I see a question in the Q&A that says, thank you for the thoughtful presentation. Questions based on the data you have now. What percentage of calls do you anticipate being handled by unarmed community members versus armed police officers? And there, I think we do have to be humble about what we don't know. We can look at our past data that shows that there's about 35% of the officer's time is responding to calls that we know before dispatch, they never lead to arrest. So you could just say, okay, about a third. But I think that data set's incomplete. I think it will require many months more of study and collaboration with the officers themselves and analysis of data, but also figuring out who is not calling for help right now that could be or should be, right? We know what our existing call volume is, but we don't know the calls that are not being placed. And what we've heard and through our public feedback is that there are people who just, they've been the victim of violent crimes, they've been the victim of property crimes, and they do not call the police department because they do not feel safe or comfortable inviting weapons into their homes, for example, to take reports. And they don't have trust that the criminal justice system in general is going to protect them throughout their interactions. So they just don't call anyone. And I think a good number of those calls could end up being responded to by community solution workers as well. Folks who say, listen, my bike was stolen. I do want to make a report for my insurance or in case it's found in the jungle or somebody sees it on the street, but I don't, I feel uncomfortable around firearms. I don't want anybody with a gun to show up. Could you send an unarmed person to take a report? I think that is a part of demilitarizing our public safety response.
And thank you, Pastor Wright and Mayor Myrick. Other comments, questions, concerns?
I can keep going here if nobody, like I'm a preacher with a microphone, so I can go. So as we think about adding, creating this new department, what immediate changes would there be then to IPD in particular? Because you hear a lot about, this plan calls for abolishing the police and it's getting rid of, and I know that there's been some confusing messages and messaging and just got a lot of misinformation out there. So if this plan as is passed and adopted, what immediate impact does it have on IPD?
Yeah, the immediate impact is frankly very little. The draft proposal, it is 100 pages, and 100 pages is in governmentese not much. What it really is an outline or a roadmap for the path forward, and that roadmap would have to be filled out by months and frankly years of continued community input and collaboration design. The most immediate impacts, the ones that could happen most quickly, would be the creation of a director. So having the police chief report to a director of public safety and community solutions would probably be the first step. And then designing the community solutions officer's job descriptions, allocating money in the budget towards it. Those would be the next, if I were to predict, those would be the next outcomes. And then the transition of the SWAT truck from the police department up towards the Tompkins County Department of Emergency Response. I think those would be the ones you'd see happen in the coming months, but the rest of the changes would happen more progressively over time.
Dr. Clark, I'm leaving room, but I'll jump whenever.
Oh no, that's fine. Actually, I was going to say I think it might be time for me to transition to your moderation.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Clark, for shifting. So we're going to be transitioning now to the part where those who are those who are participating in the Zoom, and I believe if you are watching on YouTube, if you put something in the chat or something, I think that'll get to us. I do want to just simply ask Jason one question, and then we'll open it up. So I think Dr. Eversley Bradwell and Dr. Gonzalez mentioned 130 participants in all of this in terms of the focus groups that were done. Given the county is more than just Ithaca, the city of Ithaca, do you feel like these are the do you feel like these recommendations reflect the will of the entire county?
I think
Jason, you want me to jump in real quick just to give some additional context about the data that we use?
Please do, Dr. Bradwell.
So Reverend Wright, that's an excellent question. And we are making the distinction between sort of data and input. And so the county and the city put out a number of venues. If I'm not mistaken, there were six different community forums that had a total of roughly 90 speakers. We had 64 pages of emails to go through that people who could send in email feedback. There was a questionnaire that was put out that had 236 responses, of which 129 came from outside the city of Ithaca. We completed 15 individual interviews. And I should make mention our focus groups were both in Zoom because of COVID and in person, knowing that not everyone uses technology, of course, being very safe and socially distant. And so it was a large array of input that Dr. Gonzalez and I went through for our portion of the appendix that included, in addition to the 130 plus folks who participated in focus groups. I just felt it'd be important for the community to know that there was a significant amount of input, but we're limiting our data to the focus groups.
Thank you.
My apologies, Jason. It's all right. I don't know that I have much to add. I mean, Dr. Bradwell brought the data and some of the facts to the table. I would just make a general statement, Reverend Wright, that I think the vast majority of the recommendations can be applied in probably most communities, to be honest with you. We're talking about treating our community members humanely. We're talking about breaking down systemic barriers. We're talking about how do we end racist practice and discriminatory practices. So if what we've put forward can achieve those outcomes, then I don't know that the jurisdictional boundary matters, to be honest with you. I think it should be universally applied. And we talk about culture in an organization, and I think those practices, from an equity perspective, doesn't matter where it is. I would think that any of these recommendations could apply to any community. There are nuances to our communities, right? Ours is a little different than the one next to us, so on and so forth. But I think the fundamental core, the values here, should be universal. That's just my opinion.
A question from the chat, and a lot of folks are hearing that the working groups found out about recommendations fairly late in the process, or with a lot of input, and you kind of already answered that. Is that a truism?
Yeah, the focus groups. Yeah, we gave the process. So the good professor was concerned because he didn't see the report until it came out. But that is true of all the working groups. So a lot of the suggestions came from the working groups. They came from the focus groups. They came from the survey, and those were compiled, annotated, and edited by the leadership group, which included Jason and myself. And we have not, I think the thrust of the question, so it is true that there are folks on the working groups who won't agree with some of the recommendations. And it's also true that many entire chunks of the recommendations, whole sentences and paragraphs, and pages came directly from many of the working groups. So it is, so part of the process of working together as a group is that not everyone will agree with what's in the recommendations. in the end, but I think focusing on what's actually in the recommendations. There's a lot of meat there to dig into. If there's substantive suggestions or changes that are proposed, I think that's the most useful way to spend our time, is figuring out how to improve the report.
We'll continue on with the questions, but I do want to give space for Pastor Benson. I think I cut him off in a comment.
Most preachers are groups. I'll leave that alone. I want to address Brad's comment, because I think that it's so important to know that if I'm working in a particular job and I don't see no end, then I heard his voice, and the voice was, what can a Black man expect if he's going to join the police force? And he's going to stay in that particular beat? Is there room for advancement? And he was saying within, and if it's not working on the inside, then I have a fair, in other words, it's fair on the inside for those who are in authority, that I can look to move ahead or move up in the police department. Then that I think he said we need to address that. What kind of advantage does a Black man have in working in the police department? He doesn't see himself moving ahead. And that was painful for him as a policeman, realizing that the inside group was not concerned about 4 Black men that were raised here in Ithaca.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a vital thing that I think that we need to look at when we're reimagining, hey, can I get an advancement if I start with the police department? What's my advantage of being on the police department and moving ahead to be the mayor of?
Yeah, it's such a very true and important point. And a series of the recommendations do talk about the importance of diversity and recruitment and retention, and changing all of our systems to make those things easier for diverse candidates. But it's also about starting from a fresh culture, starting with a new culture in which the expectations for what gets rewarded and who gets promoted are clear to everybody from the jump, from the beginning. This is something that our department, I'll just speak very frankly, has struggled with in the last 20 years. There's and it's an old culture bumping up against the new culture. The old culture being, well, my uncle was in policing and he got promoted to sergeant because he made the most arrests of his shift. And then he got promoted to lieutenant because he kicked down the most doors and seized the most drugs. And then he got promoted to deputy chief because he did the same thing as lieutenant. While the community was saying, we want a different, more community-centered kind of policing and public safety. So there was a tension that exists inside the police department and inside the administration about, when you look at 2 different resumes, who are you promoting? Is it the most active officer and that the one who pulled over the most people? Or is it the one that has built the most trust inside the community? And frankly, the largest schisms that have happened inside our department have happened over exactly that question. Now, I won't get into, because much of it's protected, the actual people that we're talking about here. But I will say that I believe that representation really matters. And that comes through loud and clear in this report, that we need more women who are working in public safety because they're better communicators, they're better de-escalation, they're better at conflict resolution, and particularly when it comes to intimate partner violence or sexual assault. The presence of women in your public safety department actually encourages people to come forward and leads most often to just outcomes and convictions, more often than if you don't have a good percentage of women on the force. But I also believe that you have to have people of color, that representation really does matter. I mean, I was proud to promote the first Black person to become a deputy chief in the city, the first Black person to become a chief of police in the city, and the first Black person to become a judge, not just in the city of Ithaca, but in our entire 20 county circuit. And because I think those lived experiences and that diversity inside an organization leads to generally better outcomes because you just have a range of perspectives. I'll stop talking in a second, but those perspectives are valuable. And in setting a culture from the jump where everybody in the department knows diversity is valuable to us because it helps us see the floor in different ways. You know, I'm a Knicks fan, which is itself torture, but with basketball, it is better to be tall, right? We know that. You're closer to the rim, you can block people better. Should we just have an 11-person team of 7-footers if being tall is better? Well, no, of course not. Because if you did, you couldn't defend the other team. There's certain passes you couldn't make, right? There's certain plays you couldn't make because you're all seeing the court from the same angle. That is a problem in our public safety departments. And it's one that we have to, there's no silver bullet to addressing it, but I think starting with a new culture, a new department, a civilian director, giving community solutions officers a chance to get started in the profession, and instituting all of the community involvement in our recruitment and diversity efforts is going to go a long way.
So kind of along those lines, what steps do you think will be made to ensure diverse and equitable hiring decisions are made?
Yeah, for me, that begins, especially with hiring and promotions, is bringing the community into those choices. So one of the recommendations is that we have a committee of community members that are helping to screen, to recruit, and then screen, and then recommend for hiring and promotion are the members of our public safety division. I think that's really important. I have more to say, but I'm being nudged to talk less so we can answer more questions.
Yes, thank you. I believe in starting on time and ending on time. So we are certainly running up against it. But can you speak to any plans for racial sensitivity training and kind of re-education as a part of these new initiatives? I know that one of the recommendations deals with kind of training. And so who's going to be identifying? Can you kind of speak a little bit more about those training opportunities?
I can talk a little bit about it if you'd like, Ryan. I think this focuses on really evaluating the training that we are putting our officers through. And this is a partnership, I think, with our human resource departments, our chief equity and diversity officer, and our law enforcement departments, and saying, all right, what level of training is important? What training are we, do we want to provide to our folks? When do we want to provide it? How frequently do we want to provide it? And I think addressing this either before, after the academy, before our individuals hit the street and begin to work on their own, there's an expectation, a culture, a value expectation that aligns with that training. And that continues throughout their department and their workforce. I mean, this also talks about changing culture and expectations. Part of this initiative is really getting teams of folks together and really identifying that training. Something also that came up is discontinuing train the trainer perspective. So rather than us training, having a deputy or a police officer being trained to provide, bias training, it's not going to be our own training, it's bringing in outside folks to do the training. So it's a fresh perspective. So there isn't complacency in the training that's going on, and that it continues to remain consistent as we go through this process, rather than having our own train the trainer. And that may seem like a small initiative, but I think it's an important step in the right direction to ensuring that we're getting consistent training throughout this process. I don't have details as specifically as to this type of training course or this type of focus. I think that's really, and unfortunately, this I think is a point of frustration. So I'll acknowledge it now. The report is a larger, probably 20 to 30,000 foot level report. It provides concepts, it provides direction, and really the next step after adoption is to refine those recommendations and then get the monetary resources to put them in place. And I know that a lot of folks have expressed some frustration of how will this work? What's the detail to that? And I think that supports the Community Justice Center in hiring that staff and that support behind identifying how we're going to actually implement these things in some more detail. So I also think, just to piggyback on what's been said earlier, accountability is important. Transparency is important in this process as we go through that planning process, and keeping us accountable, constantly keeping questions coming, in that continual community engagement is going to be a key component to saying, how is this moving through the process? So we want to know more about this publicly. I think that's going to be an important effort we have to ensure to keep in the spotlight as we go through this, as we start to develop these recommendations further into implementation, and making sure that information is accessible to the public, and continuing to have forums like this to gauge input and engage feedback. And that's an important piece of the accountability component of this, I think.
Certainly, and folks who are watching, please make sure you can still put questions in the chat. We'll be here as long as folks' schedule allows, and we'll answer as many as we can. We want to go back to kind of the focus groups. So were they given access to the draft recommendations, and were they able to provide input on the draft recommendations, or did that come? How did that work out? Memory
serves, they were given the draft recommendations Friday before the report was released to the public on Monday. The good news is that they can still release responses to the draft because it is a draft and it's a living document. And we wanted the entire community to be able to see it at once and react to it and respond to it and give their input. So they can do that through the portal. If you just Google Reimagining Public Safety, Tompkins County, City of Ithaca, any combination of those words, frankly, the portal will pop right up, and there's a link to submit their feedback on the recommendations. And I say by March 31st, but in reality, this conversation goes beyond March 31st, and the opportunity to give feedback on this, a living document. That is, what do I say when I say it's a living document? I mean, nothing becomes law on April 1st. Right? A report and a roadmap becomes adopted by the council and the legislature, but everything can still evolve, change, and transform. So we're now, about a month into everybody from the working group having the opportunity to give feedback on the recommendations.
Reverend Wright, can I just add something real quick? Because I've been trying to follow this process. And again, I want to make it clear that I did not write the recommendations. So my job here tonight isn't to support or to affirm any of the recommendations, though I do think there are significant recommendations that our community needs to follow. I've said in other forums, for us to do nothing now is far more dangerous than to do what is presented to us. And what people should understand about the process is that this was a process where two different drafts were handed to Tompkins County legislatures and the Ithaca Common Council. They will ultimately approve whatever the plan is. So folks who may not like the plan, contact your representative. They're going to make recommendations to change language. They're going to make motions to withdraw certain aspects of the recommendations. Whatever it may be, folks may have strong feelings one way or the other about what is included in the plan. And ultimately, the folks who decide whatever is included in this plan as a blueprint to move forward will be the legislatures and Common Council. So I just want to make sure folks understand the process, that this plan is not set in stone, and we will need, if I'm not mistaken, or Jason and Savante, the 30th or the 31st are the intended plans, but they'll want a final draft before then. So folks should be reaching out to various community, to the representatives, to make their voice heard as much as possible. I just felt compelled to say that the process is extremely important. What I will reiterate is that we have to do something.
Thank you, Dr. Eversley Bradwell. I do want to ask, what are the main sources of resistance and opposition of law enforcement to these recommendations?
I'm loath to speak on their behalf. I think there's a lot of concern about their jobs, first and foremost, right? They work very hard to get these jobs. Most of them are very proud of their jobs. And what we find in these careers in law enforcement is it does become a big part of their identity. And so a shift to a new department is scary, and they're concerned about it. And we are working with council to to reassure folks that they will maintain their job protections in their careers. Beyond that, I don't know. Jason, maybe you want to speculate. I'm a little loath to speculate.
I'm not going to speak on behalf of any law enforcement officer, but I think there's a genuine concern. You're talking about change. You're questioning systems that people are familiar with, that they've worked within in years, if not decades. There's uncertainty. I think the biggest fear is when people can't predict the future or what the future beholds. It creates a concern and fear and speculation. So I think those are all things that contribute to objections of some law enforcement. At the same point in time, we have a lot of law enforcement officers that I think are embracing some of this change and accepting it and supporting it. So I don't want to get into a us versus them analogy of this, but I think an open mind and an understanding of approach is going to be an important piece of the puzzle. So I think that's. I think it's probably all I can add to that. Obviously, not being a law enforcement officer myself, but there's been a lot of positive feedback and negative feedback, and is trying to understand what's the best path forward collectively to bring good change to the community.
So why wait so long to implement some of these recommendations or all of these recommendations? Can we get started right away?
Yes, I think we can. I think there's different timelines that has to be developed primarily to kind of piggyback what I had said before, is that some of this takes time. It takes time to plan. It takes time to put resources together. I think what's important is that the ball continues to move forward. The needle continues to move in the right direction. Accountability and transparency stays in the forefront. The resources are put towards it. And probably it's a fair statement to say that's not quick enough. And I think we all recognize that. And I think the only thing we can do is as with this plan, these plans are adopted, the next day we start working towards, as I've mentioned before, this is the first step of a longer stairwell that we have to work towards. And we just continue to be committed and personally committed, professionally committed, and work with our partners to go through this. So I don't think any of it stops. It continues to evolve and continues to move forward. Some will be a little harder to initiate only because of the complexities with it, but I think that the foot needs to continue to stay on the gas pedal moving forward with these recommendations.
Can you speak to the job description for community solutions workers? Will they have the same physical requirements to traditional law enforcement officers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think the report made detailed recommendations on that. I think that's one of the things the Community Justice Center and the Common Council have to put together over those months as we're working and designing. I can imagine that there will be a different set of job requirements. I think the physical requirements would also be different, I believe, especially if they're not tasked with making arrests. So yeah, no, not yet decided. And if there are suggestions, it's a great time to make them and put them in writing to council at cityofithaca.org.
And do officer background checks consider family background and criminal history of family members? Would they do so following these recommendations if they don't?
Yeah, I'll ask Shelley, who's on the line, if she has a more detailed answer to this. I will say that we do detailed background checks, background investigations into the officers we hire now. We also are, really leading the country, and it is difficult to become a member of the Ithaca Police Department. We have a very high standard, including screenings for. We do psychological screenings, and we think that's an important part of making sure that you're hiring the right people from the jump. Shelley's not come off mute yet, which means I might be alone in the. Hey. But what about the families in particular? Do you know the answer to that?
Well,
I'm not sure to what degree the question is being asked, but the background check does look at quite a broad spectrum of involvement. So and I wouldn't say that, if you have someone in your family who has a criminal history, that is going to affect you if you're not involved in that criminal history. So, as an applicant.
And this one is kind of connected to the process, given, and this will be our last one for the night. Given kind of these new recommendations, this reimagining public safety, what is the current status of our search for the next or new police chief?
Yeah, so that search has not started yet. We've not posted the job description, but we want to model the recommendations, which are to have heavy community involvement in the recruitment and the screening of who leads the department. Now, if council agrees to move forward with the new Department of Public Safety and Community Solutions, you still would actually have a police chief inside of that department. That's a requirement of state law that if you have more than 4 folks who are categorized as police officers in New York State, which is what the public safety workers would be in the eyes of the state, you do have to have a police chief. So we have to hire a police chief, but that chief would be the head of the public safety worker division, and they'd be reporting to the director of public safety and community solutions. So where are we in the search? We've not yet posted it, but hope to do so soon.
Great. Well, thank you all for an amazing time together. I know that you guys have done a lot of these. Thank you for continuing to do them. Community engagement is going to be vitally important. And for those who are watching and those who have participated, as Dr. Eversley Bradwell said, make sure that you're contacting council, contacting your legislative representatives, and make your voice heard. So that wherever we go, I think he was absolutely right. That we know we can't stay here, and so something has to be done. And so, while I'm certain that where we are is not enough, let's figure out how we can move together as community. Thank you to all of my fellow panelists and Dr. Clark and JR and Pastor Benson and all who helped work behind the scenes so we can make our county, our community, a much safer and better place for all of us.
Awesome. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And sorry for the long-winded answers. As my Baptist Reverend always said, I would have written a shorter sermon, but I ran out of time. And so that's how it is. Just have more to say. Thank you very much. Appreciate you hosting.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Pastor Benson. Thanks, guys.